behind every methodology is a philosophy, and behind every philosophy is a theology. So that's important.
Yeah, and we have to remind ourselves as Christian parents, what is our ultimate objective with our children. Welcome to the Living Homeschool Life podcast. We are Scott and Becky Aniol, and we are happy that you've joined us. We are starting a new podcast that we hope will be helpful to many homeschool families. This is sort of your brainchild, so what do you have in mind for we're going to do a lot of different kinds of episodes, right? What are some of the things that you have planned? I'm just here for the ride. You're going to tell me what to do. So what episodes are we doing?
So I want to do we're going to kind of do today a little bit of philosophical underpinnings so that, parents can really think through what kind of education they're giving their children.
But philosophy for normal people.
Yeah.
We're not going to get too deep, but core principles that we think all parents should be thinking through when they're educating their kids.
And things that have helped us because really, as I always say, behind every methodology is a philosophy, and behind
even if people don't know it.
And behind every philosophy is a theology. So that's important. We're also going to do some interview episodes. We've got some guests lined up to talk about everything from, different educational philosophies to book authors, like the books that we use in our homeschool curriculum, Living Heritage. We want to have some authors on here to talk about, their books and, why should your high schoolers read them or whatever. And then we're going to have some practical episodes. We might have some kids in here and do some sample lessons.
That might take multiple takes.
That will take many takes and some timeouts for some discipline probably. And we're going to also do things like talking about scheduling your day and just really practical
stuff.
Mm-hmm. So all kinds of different things. We'll see.
And we invite, even if you're watching or listening and you have some questions or ideas of what might be helpful, we'd love to hear them. Obviously, this is we've launched this new homeschool curriculum now that is going very, very well, Living Heritage Homeschool. We assume if you're watching, you probably know about it, but maybe you stumbled across this and you don't know about it. So we would encourage you to visit our website, livingheritage.com. livingheritagehomeschool.com.
livingheritagehomeschool.org.
Yeah, well, org and com, I think both work.
Okay.
But definitely visit to see the curriculum there. And again, we hope this will be a help to all homeschooling families, whether you're just starting or you're in the midst of it. We probably should give a little bit of background just in terms of our current status with kids.
So our oldest is 18. He'll be graduating in just a few short months. And then we have a 15-year-old daughter. She's about to turn 16. Yep. And an 8-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter. 6-year-old. I can't keep it straight. You should hear me at the doctor's office when they ask for their birthdays. So, those are our kids. So we have high school all the way down to first grade.
Almost 16 and 18, right.
Yeah.
So sort of spanning the gamut there. Well, what we thought we would do in this episode is sort of just walk through our story of how we kind of entered into homeschooling. And then, we've gone through some transitions in terms of methodology and philosophy. Not that our story is particularly interesting or unique. In fact, it's probably similar to many stories.
Don't turn it off. Don't turn off the podcast. It's not going to hopefully be boring.
Right, exactly, yeah. But actually why this, I think, will be helpful is because really along the way in our journey in sort of coming to conclusions regarding methodology and philosophy, this will enable us to highlight what we think are some core principles that ought to influence Christian homeschooling. And so these are all things that we'll sort of introduce as we kind of walk through our journey, but these are all things that we intend to explore at much more depth in future episodes. Like you said, sometimes through interviewing authors or interviewing people, some of whom we'll talk about in a moment, maybe were people that were instrumental in our own thinking and sort of helping us think through some things as well. So both of us were not homeschooled, so that may be true of many who are watching and listening, where homeschooling was new for us as we sort of considered it for our own children. Both of us went to sort of what you might describe as traditional Christian schools. Both of them good in terms of, certainly great in terms of, not buying into worldly philosophy. We didn't have to worry about those sorts of things in terms of bad theology and those kinds of influences. Good Christian schools, good traditional Christian schools. We had good parents who guarded those things in our own lives. But after we were married and had kids, and even before kids, which we'll talk about in a moment, began to think about, okay, how are we going to educate our kids? And homeschooling being an option, it was new for us. And so we really had to kind of think through that.
We weren't planning on homeschooling our kids, so.
Which we'll talk about. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we were married, and in our first couple years of marriage, actually right up until when Caleb was born, right, is when you were involved in homeschool and helping with homeschool co-ops and teaching history and English. So that was part of thinking through, our education of our own kids. And then was it those years before even Caleb was born that you first read Wilson's
No,
Lost Tools of
it was
Learning?
later.
It was after that.
Yeah,
I can't remember when I first read it.
When I taught music at a few Christian schools, but I taught one day a week at a homeschool collective,
right.
Where, like you said, I taught English and I taught history. But they just approached me, like I was 22, They just approached me when I was...
You had an English degree.
I did, but she just approached me when I was reading poetry at your children's choir concert.
Oh, okay.
I guess I must have read with expression or something. I don't know. And she just said, what's your degree? I can tell that you were reading that poetry with some knowledge behind it, I guess. And so then I went into that just sort of with my traditional Christian school background, but that was a classical co-op. So I was kind of thrown into that without any philosophical knowledge of what of what that was about. So
that kind of introduced the idea of classical to us a little bit, which we had heard. There was another church in town that was thinking about starting a classical school. I think that was even before we got married. So I had kind of heard about that a little bit and interested me. Both of us being interested in literature and the arts and even philosophy, a lot of the emphases we were hearing were definitely attractive to us. But probably that co-op was number one, a hands-on introduction to homeschooling. It was a co-op, so they did come together, once a week, but they were homeschooling. Yeah. So that was, introduced homeschooling to us. And then the idea of classical was sort of the beginning to be introduced to us at that point. Yeah. We then had Caleb, and then I think even had Kate when we started really thinking about, okay, what are we going to do? And I can't even remember why, really wanted us to homeschool, and you were a little reticent.
Oh, I wasn't having it
at the beginning.
I wasn't going to do it.
Yeah.
Let me back it up a little bit. So you had brought home from a conference some free books, and one of them was Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. Okay. So I remember sitting on the back porch, and I read that. I don't know why I read it. I guess it just sparked my interest for some reason, and I thought, this is something really different than what I had. So at this point, we're still planning to send our kids to school, but we happen to have a decent-sized classical Christian school 30 seconds down the road. Right. And so I was like, this is really an interesting concept. And I think really what touched me, and inspired me was the idea that the kids wouldn't be learning from textbooks.
That's a classical emphasis.
Yeah, reading the great books instead of reading excerpts written kind of in a textbook prose way, and breaking up information like that. Or textbooks, like a literature textbook, will have excerpts from different stories, but you won't be reading a whole book. So that was really intriguing to me, especially because I was an English major. But even aside from that, I liked that idea. So then I thought, well, we can send our kids to that classical school.
Christian school.
Yeah, the classical Christian school down the street. So that was the plan for a long time until you went to seminary and we moved to Texas.
Yeah, but I remember we had a conversation in the car on the way from church. I think we had both of our two oldest kids by that point. And I don't even remember, I have a terrible memory. I don't even remember why I was sort of set on homeschooling, but you really didn't want to. You wanted them to have a really high quality education, and we're just us not knowing homeschooling and even just being newly introduced to classical, we probably didn't at that point know what resources are available, what's out there.
Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning isn't really written towards homeschoolers. Like this was written in 1991, and it was before the classical movement sort of took homeschooling by storm. So it was really written in the sense you get from that book in particular, of all of the books that he wrote later. But that book in particular, it really emphasizes how the teacher communicates the love for the subject.
Right. Like an expert teacher.
I had those kind of teachers. Like even though we had textbooks, my particular Christian school, I went to the school where my teachers wrote the textbooks, so they didn't teach from the textbook.
So you had PhDs who wrote the textbooks.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, as my high school teachers, PhDs. So they were just telling the story that they loved.
Yeah.
And that's what made me love learning, not actually reading, the textbooks. So I wanted that for our kids.
Right.
I wanted them to have expert teachers. I didn't want to be that person because I wasn't a PhD in all those fields.
Right. Nobody can be an expert in all those fields at once.
Right.
Right. But I remember saying to you, and this I think, became, a core principle for us, is that, we want our kids to love reading, to love good literature, to love history, to be curious, to be self-learners. And emphasizing that is something that any parent can give their children, especially with good resources, good books, like giving our children good books where they can learn these things. I think that's when both of us started to think along those lines, having some of those experiences, reading some of those things, that it's not so much technical knowledge and filling our children's head with information. That's not, and I think that principle really comes into play a little later as well. But our children we want to be able to give them beautiful things to read and raise them to be curious about the world and to be self-learners and those sorts of things, which every parent is equipped to be able to give their children.
Absolutely. But I would even say for me, maybe that's what was going through your mind. For me, it was a lot more pragmatic.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have the money to send our kids,
right.
$20,000 a year classical school that was in Texas. So it was kind of like you were in seminary and I was living in seminary housing with 2 little kids. We're homeschooling because the public school was never an option for us. And
we had some other families at church who were homeschooling, so it was just kind of natural to maybe do some co-op stuff.
So I just checked out some books from the library, and I was like, okay, how hard can kindergarten be?
Yeah.
So for me, it wasn't. I did want to give my kids a great books education. I wanted them to be curious, but I don't think that all that philosophical stuff was really driving me.
That didn't come first.
That came later because I realized, these books are going to grab their attention. These books are going to make them curious. And if you think about it, how do we learn as adults? We don't typically go take classes.
Right.
We read books, and that's
immersion in these things is where we get the value.
But for us, it was just like we didn't have money to send our kids to Christian school, and so this is what we were going to do. And so I just figured it out a little by little. As I went.
Yeah. So, that should be an encouragement to anyone who's listening just from the beginning, right? That especially because there are so many resources and tools available. We've talked about this. When we were kids, there were very few people homeschooling.
Yeah, it was
classical
illegal.
Education wasn't a thing yet.
Right.
The Christian classical renewal wasn't a thing. So there weren't a whole lot of resources, whereas by the time our kids were at the point where we started educating, and even more so today, there are so many resources, including a fantastic curriculum called Living Heritage. But there are so many resources and good books and people who are trying to make these things more accessible to families as well. So I think the next stage for us then was those early years of Caleb's education and even Kate a little bit, and the co-op and that sort of thing. And I remember it was these families were all classically educating, which we'll talk in a later episode. That means a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
It sure does.
Classical.
Yeah, there's not one definition of classical.
We've kind of highlighted some of the core values, like not using textbooks, actually using classics, and maybe even something like the integration of different, not having subjects so siloed is pretty common to different versions of classical. And that was kind of true even at the co-op in Rockford, wasn't it, where there was some overlap? Like you did history and literature, and wasn't there some connection between the two?
Yeah, I mean, because they were using a set curriculum. So there was some integration there.
So that's common among different kinds of classical education as well. So that was true when we were in Texas of these families. But that's when, I think you've said you began to see a difference between a kind of education, even if it's classical, where it's just list memory and information accumulation and even though it's classic works and these sorts of things, it's just like filling our kids' heads with as much knowledge as possible, rhymes and little songs and lists and all this kind of thing. And that's when you kind of started to be a little dissatisfied with that and began to be exposed to some other ways of thinking, right?
Yeah. I mean, I was at that point, was that before my master's degree? I don't know.
Yeah.
I think so. But I had started listening to some podcasts and, reading more books. And then, towards the tail end of that time, I did start my master's, and we were reading a lot of books about what is biblical education. And so all of that kind of...
Like you said earlier, starting with the theology, the biblical principles, and then working back to say, okay, what educational methodology fits with that best?
Exactly. So... really just starting to understand about a relational education and not just information accumulation, like you said. And, we had lots of friends whose kids had grown up classical and smart kids, wonderful kids, nothing bad about that. But even, so what I was doing with my first grader, would that even, translate? Would they even remember like all of the lists that they were memorizing by the time they got older, And even
if they couldn't remember the list, what end?
To what end? Is that really knowledge? I mean, that's what I just started asking myself. Is chanting a bunch of lists or, all these kinds of things, is that actually knowledge? Does that child end up with a love for learning because they have a bunch of lists memorized? And a lot of times, I mean, I'm sure that there are cases where kids are, some kind of kid is just eating this up and it inspires them. I don't know. Yeah. But, for sure. But to me, the answer kept coming back to, no, that's not knowledge. That's just a list.
Right.
And they don't have any relationship with the knowledge. They don't have any love for learning. They're not curious. To learn more just because they've learned a list of things.
And it's not necessarily impacting their character or even their worldview so much. I mean, it might be information that can inform a proper way of viewing the world and loving rightly, which definitely became more of our emphasis in education. But it's not forming them as a person necessarily.
Well, it's not. And I do think that part of that disconnect, I mean, going back to what I said earlier, I think part of that disconnect is because when you're homeschooling, you're not necessarily an expert with a passion for that field. So, where a kid in a classical school, for instance, might be, and, might not be, let's face it, not all classical teachers are going to be experts in their field, but they might be memorizing lists, but their teacher is telling them the stories and really communicating a love for their subject. In homeschool, a lot of times it just gets pared down to a list.
Yeah.
And then maybe some like historical fiction. So I think there's a missing element there.
So you became sort of dissatisfied.
I did.
There was something missing. Yeah. Okay, so I want to get in a minute to what sort of resolved that for you, but I want to also highlight something that you helped me with, because this is important, I think, for us to think through. When we think about education, there's the content, but then there's also the form, there's the methodology of the teaching. And I think both of us were becoming very interested in the content being, of course, theologically sound, classic books, good literature, good history. But I was still stuck in the mindset of our traditional education upbringing of, I wanted the kids sitting at desks from 8 to 3, if we had bells, I probably would have been happy. And, all of these sorts of things. I just had this mindset of, this is disciplined education. This is rigorous education where they're, where they're sitting there.
They need to learn to sit still.
And all of that. And it probably was along the same time when you were discovering some different methodologies and some different philosophies where you were emphasizing to me, and it took me a while. It probably still hasn't quite sunk in completely. This was also tied into some of your master's research.
Yeah.
That whole way of thinking about education is actually very secular. It's sort of built on conveyor belt. Henry Ford.
Well, it goes back to the Prussians. I mean, the educational reformers of the 1860s and 70s visited Prussia to discover how they were, training their military children. And then they brought that back to the U.S. because they were trying to, this is still, the 1800s, they were trying to preserve democracy post-Civil War. Mm-hmm. So they wanted every child to be in lockstep with what the government thought. And of course, we're seeing the outflow of that today,
right.
In a really not good way. But, that was really their goal, is to make every child come out believing and thinking the same things about democracy, about religion, about everything. We see in the 1920s, Scopes monkey trial, they want, evolution came into play with all of that. It's very much a new in the history of the world way of educating. Mm-hmm. So one thing I always tell homeschoolers is that homeschool is not school at home.
Right.
Like, you're not trying to recreate a classroom mm-hmm. in your living room or at your dining table or whatever it is, because that is not a natural way to learn, and it's not necessarily even a good way to learn.
The whole philosophy is like children are like cogs in a machine, mm-hmm. and they just go through the steps, and you chunk chunk, and out comes this little block. And when the reality is that, yes, our children have a common humanity. They're all made in the image of God. There are some similarities, one child to another. But every parent knows that no two children are alike, right? They're all different.
All 4 of our children are so different and have different interests. Even that whole philosophy of memorizing lists comes into play here, because while, you want all children to have some kind of, common body of knowledge that we are passing down as a way of life, as a culture,
right.
Memorizing lists isn't really producing a heart relationship with that knowledge. And every child is going to pull something different out of what you're teaching, what they're reading. And because every child is born a person, an individual, mm-hmm. A creature of God. And so, we really have to be careful that we're not doing that. Children are, machines. Children are cogs, and all this lockstep education, whether it be lists or whether it be standardized,
that's sort of the sad irony that there are, again, good Christian educators out there who are in more of the traditional Christian education world, and the content of what they're teaching is biblical and consistent with the Christian mm-hmm. worldview. But what we're sort of highlighting here is that the methodology was impacted by Darwinian evolution, by this idea of a child as a machine, and even by philosophers like Dewey and others who actually had anti-Christian goals in mind. And we don't recognize, like you've stated, that beneath that methodology is that philosophy and theology, and we need to be thinking about all those things mm-hmm. in terms of education.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get then to where everything sort of converged. So there's a lot of pieces that are coming together, and you're starting to educate Caleb and then also Kate. And then you're doing some reading. You started to listen to some podcasts, and you're beginning, because of summer work and master's degree, starting to do some of your own research into some of this history. So that all started then converging in a different sort of underpinning philosophy of education that we really hadn't encountered before. So how did that sort of come to be, and kind of describe the core, some of those core principles that really began to strike you as, okay, this is actually the better way to educate our children?
Yeah, well, so my master's degree that we've mentioned a few times, I didn't ever say what that was in. So my master's degree was in Christian education. Mm-hmm. So really, I was in the classroom in the summers with a bunch of Christian school teachers and Christian school principals and that kind of thing. And I was just there for my own enrichment because, we lived there and you were a professor at the seminary. So we were really digging into biblical principles of education. And, at the same time, I'm homeschooling. So I'm kind of seeing, what our kids are taking in and how they're processing it and all these kinds of things. And they're two very different kids. I mean, our oldest two especially are very, very different in the way they learn and in the things that they love and all that. So I'm doing that. And then we were in a co-op where they were doing like art classes and music classes at that time. And so I had just like 2 hours where I would sit in the hallway and I was listening to podcasts. So I was just gleaning ideas from Cindy Rollins and people like that who were talking about classical education, but in a very different way. And then in my master's research too, my master's thesis was on different types of classical education. Like how are we in the modern day defining classical education? Because it's not just one thing. Like somebody's saying it's trivium as stages, and then somebody else is saying, no, it's not. It's all 7 liberal arts from kindergarten on up. And then somebody else, so we had several different movements kind of going parallel to each other, especially in the, early 2000s. So I'm doing this research. And so I'm hearing people, from this side and from this side, and my hands are getting caught into the microphone here, but, I talk with my hands, from all these different places saying that Charlotte Mason was really the most authentic expression of classical education. And I was like, Charlotte Mason. And
these were even people, heads of classical publishers and well-known speakers in the classical world who you were hearing this from, right?
And then even in my master's seminars, we had like a head of school from our local classical school come in and say this. And, so I'm hearing this from, podcasts. I'm hearing this from people in my master's degree, from my reading, from my research. And so, and then my main professor of my master's program had Charlotte Mason's volumes, which were out of print at that time. So Tyndale House brought those into print in the, I want to say late 80s or early 90s. And then they went out of print and they were hard to find. Like you couldn't find them. And finally, I think they went into public domain. And then that is how, then all of a sudden now we have 2 or 3 publishers who brought those back into print. But at the time I was doing my research in the early 2000s, those were still out of print. So she had all of the pink volumes. They were called the Pinks. And so she was talking about that, and I ended up, and I can't remember if it was my master's or my PhD, where we actually read Charlotte Mason's 6th volume as part of our research and discussed it in our class. But so I am getting introduced to these ideas. I think one of the things that struck me first was the memory work, that it was a different quality of memory work. We are, the Charlotte Mason people were saying, memorize things that are going to inspire ideas, that are going to put a spark in your soul, really. So scripture verses.
Beautiful things, yeah.
Beautiful things that are going to, keep rolling around in your mind. And, when you're in a dark time in your life that you can think back on, and these are the things that you want to call to memory. So scripture, hymns, poems, Shakespeare, all these kind of things that are rich and beautiful, and that grow in your heart, because these are living ideas.
So that someday when the kids get older, they can recite this list, but to what end? Or they can recite this poetry to their children that they learned when they were kids, and it's valuable in and of itself. It's beautiful and true and good in and of itself.
Yeah, it has intrinsic value.
Yeah.
And so
because we can only have so much in our minds. I think I've heard you say something like this. Like there's only so much room. Why would we fill it with just a list of facts when we can fill it with something that is of intrinsic worth and value and beauty, like a poem or a hymn or
scripture.
Or scripture,
yeah.
right?
And I mean, we only have so much room in our minds. We also only have so much time in our day, and we only have so much time in our school year. So we can't, there are certain things, let's face it, there are certain things you have to just memorize rote. You have to memorize your multiplication tables. But let's not do that in isolation. Let's do that while at the same time we're understanding the context for multiplication, that we're understanding how it works as part of addition. So We're not memorizing just lists in isolation. And I think that is that's kind of where the difference comes in philosophies of education. And that was what really, I was like, wait, what? That the memorization and the idea of pegs, which was a big in at least one of the classical iterations, the idea of having pegs of facts that you later hang the ideas on, and that this is flip-flopped in Charlotte Mason, where you have ideas, you spark the imagination first, you have the story and the groundwork, and then later you can hang the facts on. So you know the story of William the Conqueror and Harold on the beach at Normandy, and you're inspired by it, and you're like, this is an amazing story. And then later you say, that was in 1066.
Right, so they already love it and they want to know more about it, and so it's not a fact detached from
Right, it's easy
something.
to remember 1066 because you have that whole thing playing through your mind of that entire story that you read about and you were inspired by, or the Spanish Armada, and Queen Elizabeth and Philip of Spain and all of that. And then later you're like, and that was in 1588, and you can put that into context. So really it's, where do the facts come and where do the ideas come, and the order is switched.
I think this is something else that I had to reorient my mind, because I had this, again, from a sort of a traditional education mindset, and even a lot of classical versions of classical education, that reversed way of thinking in my mind. Like, there's a set body of knowledge that my kids need to know, and if they don't know this, then they're behind, and they're, but I think because I was also compelled just with my love of good literature and beauty, when you started talking about these things, I was won over, but it took a little time. Sometimes it takes, those of us who are not educated this way, we naturally kind of think, all right, here is where my child needs to be, because some standard somewhere says they need to be here. They need to know this body of knowledge, et cetera.
And at this certain time.
And at this certain time,
right. With a certain way of testing.
Right. And if they're just learning poetry and reading beautiful stories, then they're going to be behind.
Yeah.
And there's that temptation.
There's a big temptation there, because we're trying to quantify everything, and we're measuring our children's success and our own success as homeschool parents based on whether or not our children pass or fail, whether or not they have these sets of facts that they can spout off. But really, that's not necessary. I mean, the way that we're educating is really the way that we should be thinking about education in all of life. And it's just, I've heard Cindy Rollins say this on her podcast, but little drops of water and little grains of sand. It's a long game. We're not going to necessarily be like, my child can recite all the presidents of the United States, at 6 years old. But we are seeing that they have learned about all the presidents. I mean, the example I always go back to is Caleb when we were in England. Do you remember this? We were sitting outside Windsor Castle, and we I don't know if we had just gone through Windsor Castle or what, but we were sitting on a bench because Christopher was in timeout on the bench across the way. That. Okay, so he was sitting next to me eating an ice cream cone, and we were, obviously we're at Windsor Castle, right? We had just been talking about kings of England. He sat there and he recited all the kings of England, all of them.
Which you had never assigned as a list to memory. I
never taught him that. Yeah. And I said, I looked at him. How old was he, 10 when we went there? I said, how did you know the kings of England? Like all the way back to like the Ethelreds. And I mean, I don't even, and he said, well, because I've read all the stories about them. And so he was literally playing a story in his head. Yeah. And saying, okay, this guy, and then this guy, and then this guy, and then there was James, and then there was Charles, and there was Charles, and there was James, and Right. So he remembered all the stories, and so he could put all those kings in order, but they all had a context.
Yeah, relationships within his own mind. Yeah.
He was building a relationship with knowledge.
Yeah, and I was just gonna go there as we sort of conclude this discussion, and that we're seeing the fruit of that now, especially with the older kids. I mean, just last night there was some trivia question that was asked about who was the vice president of so and so, and Caleb knew it, not because that's ever been assigned as a list, but because he has grown to love history. He has grown to love political history and presidential history in particular, so he's gone out of his way to read extra things in that area and just learn those things. But Kate is not necessarily interested in that, so she has a body of knowledge that's different than his.
Even though she knows about history,
right.
but her interests have taken her different directions. Right. So, yeah, it's really interesting to see them interact.
Allowing them to grow as individuals.
Yeah.
And we're seeing some of the fruit of that. I remember, again, years ago now, the first time I started hearing our kids cite information that we had not even really taught them. And I'm coming to realize, well, they're learning this because they love to read and they're curious and they're reading these things for themselves. Some of them books that maybe you had assigned, but then some things even not things that had been assigned to them because they love these things and are inquiring after these things of their own volition. So we've seen the fruit of this, and we as people who have not been educated this way, and this is maybe a lesson for all of us, needed to shake off some of those extra expectations that, if you actually look in the history of education, weren't expectations. These are, like you said earlier, relatively new.
Like 150 years old in the history of the world, the thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah, and we have to remind ourselves as Christian parents, what is our ultimate objective with our children. Obviously, we want them to succeed in life. We want them to be able to get a job and support family and all of that. But at the core, at the foundation of even those goals, is that we want them to be disciples of Jesus Christ, and we want them to form character consistent with the Bible. We want them to view the world both intellectually, but even perhaps more so with the way that they sort of fit the things of the world together, and their loves and their hatreds. We want all of that to be shaped by Scripture and by Christ-likeness. And if those things are formed within them, then everything else will fall into place. They'll have a work ethic that is conducive to a career, but not because their goal is a career, but because they want to be like Christ.
Well, yeah, and because they have learned to value excellence, because they have learned to love and recognize beauty, because all these things, are going to form discerning, wise individuals. More than any list or textbook or standardized test could ever do. They will have a body of knowledge, but more importantly, they will know what is right and what is wrong, what is good, what is beautiful, what is true, because they will have recognized that.
Yeah. And I think that's key too. That was, for me, I think, one of the points of the journey is hearing leaders kind of in classical education who are speaking at the conferences, who themselves were saying classical education is going through a transformation. It's going through a little bit of a growth.
Yeah.
It started with rigorous truth accumulation using classics, and avoiding, false biblical anti-biblical ideologies. Okay, that's good as far as it goes.
Tearing them apart, it's in an analysis kind of a way.
Right. And then I remember hearing, people talk about the fact that it started to move towards, okay, but we need to be concerned about the character, about forming wisdom, about the goodness aspect, the morality that we want to be forming in our children. And then perhaps, a further development in recognizing the importance of beauty. You hear about these three transcendent ideas, truth, goodness, and beauty, and the modern classical renewal has sort of followed that trajectory, and then you discovering the Charlotte Mason emphasis kind of brings all of that together, maybe even in a better way than some of these other forms.
Charlotte
Mason. I mean, for yourself.
Yes.
Hearing of it from others and then introducing me to it. Well, all of these things are things that we plan to further discuss through interviews with authors and other people, maybe some of the same podcast hosts that helped you and those sorts of things. These are all things that can help us think more biblically and holistically about how we educate our children. But hopefully this is at least an encouragement for you. Maybe you're just starting in your homeschool journey and trying to think, how can I do this? Maybe you're overwhelmed with the prospect of it like we were. But just step back and realize that nobody knows your children more than you do, right, as parents, and that there are tools available to you, and you can truly, if the Bible says that we as parents are the ones who are to disciple our children, well, that includes their educational journey. And this has really, kind of formed the way that we think about education. So we hope it's helpful for you as well. Again, we hope that you will take a look at Living Heritage Homeschool curriculum if you haven't. And also, thank you for listening or watching to this first episode. We hope that you will subscribe. If you're on YouTube, click the little bell thing after you subscribe so you'll be notified when the next episode comes out, because we have some good episodes planned, interview guests already lined up, things that we want to talk about. And as I said at the beginning, please do contact us if you have a question, if you have something you've been wondering about, if you have a topic that you think might be helpful, or even an individual that might be helpful for us to interview. Please reach out. We'd be happy to consider those. But thanks so much for listening. Please join us next time for the next episode of Living Homeschool Life.